The Complete Travels of Saruman, before the Lord of the Rings. There is a wizard who walked the length of Middle-earth for 1700 years before he ever sat in a tower. Not the wizard you think you know. Not the white-robed politician with the serpent's tongue and the broken staff at the end. The other one. The one who arrived on the shores of Middle-earth in the Third Age year 1000 and immediately turned east, away from the elves and the Dunedain and the comfortable western lands, and walked toward the dark places, toward Sauron's shadow, toward the ruins of things that should not have been studied. This isn't speculation pulled from thin air. This is in Tolkien's own notes, in unfinished tales, in the appendices, in his letters. It's there. It has always been there. The movies just never told you about it, because the movies needed Saruman to appear fully formed in a tower, already turning, already choosing. The reality is older and stranger, and considerably more unsettling. Because here is the question that the lore has been sitting with, quietly, for decades. Was Saruman's fall a failure of his will, or was it a flaw in the Valar's design? Did Manwë send a craftsman scholar to resist a craftsman tyrant, knowing, somewhere in that vast and ancient mind, that the student of darkness would eventually become indistinguishable from what he studied? We are going to follow Saruman, every step, every century. From the Grey Havens to the east, from the east back to the councils of the west, from the councils to Orthanc, from Orthanc to ruin. And by the time we reach the end, I think you will feel something shift, something about what Saruman was, something about what he was sent here to do, and something about the terrible gap between those two things. Let us begin before the beginning. Before Saruman was Saruman, he was Curanir. This is the Sindarin name the elves gave him, and it means the one of cunning skill, or more precisely, the man of craft. That word craft carries weight in Tolkien's world. It does not mean merely talent or competence. Craft is the deepest thing an Ainu of Aule's lineage could possess, the impulse to make, to shape, to impose order on matter through knowledge and will. The Silmarillion's Valaquenta tells us that Aule desires to make things of his own that shall be new and shall not be a repetition of the thought of Ilúvatar. And this maker's hunger is the defining mark of his people. Saruman was of Aule's people. He arrived in Middle-earth wearing craft the way other beings wear their faces. Tolkien says it explicitly in the letters. Letter 144, written to Naomi Mitchison. He describes the Astari as Maiar who have chosen physical embodiment, subject to the temptations of the flesh, genuinely capable of failure. And he identifies Saruman's deepest nature as Aulian, the craftsman's love of things made and things mastered. The man who would end his days obsessing over a ring did not develop that obsession in Orthanc. He arrived in Middle-earth already carrying it. The ring lore came later. The hunger for the ring lore came with him on the ship. Now hold that, because this is the thing that changes every century that follows. Picture this. Third Age 1000. The Grey Havens, the ports of Mithlond on the western coast of Middle-earth. The sea is grey and cold. 3 ships arrive from the west, from Valinor, from a place none of the beings on these shores have left and returned from. From those ships come 5 figures, all of them old in appearance, all of them cloaked in travelers' robes, all of them more than they appear. Círdan the shipwright meets them on the shore. He is among the oldest beings in Middle-earth. A mariner who has been watching the sea for so long that he can feel intention in the wave patterns. He looks at these 5 new arrivals and he knows. He knows which one carries the greatest fire. It is not Saruman. Círdan gives his ring, the third of the 3 elven rings, to Gandalf. Not to the head of the order, not to the one the Valar officially designated as their chosen leader. To the grey one, the wandering one. The one who seems the least impressive at first glance. And the reason Círdan gives for this choice, recorded in Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, in the Silmarillion, is devastating in its simplicity. He says that Gandalf will have the greatest need of it. He says that he perceives in Gandalf the greatest spirit and the greatest labor to come. Saruman is already at his most dangerous in this moment, and he has not yet done anything wrong. The danger is not that he is corrupt. It is that he is not corrupt, and he knows Círdan's choice, and he files it away. Unfinished Tales tells us that Saruman was jealous and quickly resentful of any disparagement or rivalry, and that Círdan's choice of Gandalf was something he did not forget. This is the man who will lead the White Council. This is the Valar's chosen instrument for resisting Sauron. And on the very first day of his mission, on the shore before he has even turned inland, he has already begun collecting a grievance. But that is a story for the middle of his life. First, he goes east. This is the detail that the casual fan never encounters, because the films have no room for it, and the main text of The Lord of the Rings does not discuss it, and it is sitting in Unfinished Tales, in the Istari section, almost hidden in plain sight. After arriving in the West, Saruman does not stay in the West. He does not begin his ministry with the elves of Rivendell, or the men of Gondor, or the rangers of the North. He turns around and walks toward Rhûn. Tolkien gives us frustratingly little about what happens there. Christopher Tolkien, in his editorial notes to the section, flags the Eastern journey as significant and notes that the text leaves it almost entirely undeveloped. We have the fact. We do not have the details. What Tolkien gives us instead is a context, and the context tells us almost everything. Because here is what we know about the East, in the Third Age, year 1000. Sauron had been in various stages of rebirth and dispersal for 2,500 years by this point. After the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, after Númenor's fall, after the defeat at the end of the Second Age when Isildur cut the ring from his hand, he had been rebuilding, and the East is where he rebuilt. The Easterlings, Tolkien's term for the various peoples east of Rhûn, were under his influence or his dominion across much of the Third Age. The Silmarillion, in the concluding section of The Rings of Power and the Third Age, tells us that Sauron's shadow extended over vast territories beyond the mapping range of the Dúnedain. These are not empty lands. They are populated by peoples who have been shaped by a millennium and a half of Sauron's influence since the forging of the rings. The marks are everywhere, in the culture, in the religion, in the architecture, in the surviving servants who remember serving him before Isildur's victory. The East, in the year 1000, is a landscape haunted by Sauron's methods. His fingerprints are on everything, and Saruman walks into it. Pay close attention to what Tolkien tells us about why Saruman was chosen to lead the Order. The passage in the Istari, in Unfinished Tales, is careful about the reasoning. Saruman is appointed head of the Istari, the head of the Order, the one the Valar designate as their chief instrument, because of his lore of the enemy. Not because he is the most powerful, not because he is the most faithful, because he knows the most about Sauron. This is the Valar's logic. They are sending craftsmen to resist a craftsman, and they want the craftsman who best understands how the enemy works. The East is where you go to learn that. Think about what that means for the decades Saruman spends in Rhûn. He is not wandering aimlessly. He is working. He is the most educated and intentional of the Istari, and he has arrived in the one region of Middle-earth where Sauron's influence has been operating longest and most deeply on mortal cultures. He walks through communities that have been worshipping a shadow for generations. He studies the remnant servants. He finds the ruins of things Sauron built and examines how they were built. He talks to people who remember stories from their grandparents about what the Shadow's servants required of them. He traces the methods. He maps the techniques. He learns, very specifically and in great technical detail, how Sauron works. And this is the critical thing. This is what the premise has been building toward from the beginning of the video. This process, this scholarly immersion in the mechanics of darkness, is not a corruption of Saruman's mission. It is the mission. He is doing exactly what the Valar sent him to do, and every step he takes into Sauron's eastern shadow is simultaneously a step toward the wisdom that could resist Sauron, and a step toward the enthrallment that could not. The question of which destination he is walking toward will not be answered for centuries. Maybe Saruman himself does not know, in the year 1050, which destination he is approaching. But here is what nobody asks. What did Saruman find in the east that he brought back? We are told in unfinished tales that his particular expertise, the lore that made him invaluable to the Valar, was the lore of rings and of the works of Sauron. This is not generic knowledge of Sauron's power. This is specific, technical, craftsman-level understanding of what Sauron made and how he made it, and what those made things do. Rings of power are not magical accessories. They are, as Tolkien's cosmological architecture establishes throughout the legendarium, extensions of the Maker's will, bound to the life and purpose of their creator. To understand them requires understanding the Maker's intention at a level of intimacy that is almost indistinguishable from sympathy. You cannot study a masterwork without developing some understanding of why it was made. And you cannot develop that understanding without, on some level, feeling its logic, its internal consistency, the beauty of it, in the way that terrible things have a beauty when they are perfectly achieved. Saruman, in the East, is not just cataloguing Sauron's methods. He is learning to see through Sauron's eyes, because that is what understanding requires. And he is doing it alone. This matters. The other Istari have companions, connections, regular contact with the elves and men of the West. Gandalf wanders, but he wanders toward people, toward hobbits and dwarves and rangers, always refilling whatever he expends in company. The blue wizards go east as well, LOTR and Pelando, and they vanish from the record entirely, their fate a separate tragedy. But Saruman's eastern journey is documented as solitary scholarship, and solitude is its own kind of risk when what you are studying is darkness. There is no one to notice what it is doing to you. There is no one to say, you have been in these ruins for 3 months now and you are starting to think the person who built them had a point. Picture this. Rune, perhaps the year 1050, or 1100, or 1150, when Saruman has been traveling for decades. The landscape is vast and indifferent, grassland giving way to drier terrain, to lands with a different color of sky, a different quality of wind. He is standing in the ruins of something that Sauron's servants built in the Second Age, perhaps a fortress, perhaps a temple, perhaps simply a way station for armies moving west. The stone is worked with a precision that no mortal hand could achieve unaided, the joints so tight they seem grown rather than cut. And Saruman studies the joints. He runs his fingers along the fitting. He recognizes the technique. He has seen its cousin in the works of Ole, in the craft traditions he carries in his oldest memory. And he feels a complicated thing that is partly revulsion and partly recognition. Because the builder of this stone knew what he was doing. The builder understood materials at a level that is genuinely admirable from a purely technical standpoint. The builder had mastered something. The builder was Sauron, or Sauron's direct servant, and the mastery was in service of horror. But the craft itself, the craft is just craft. This is the moment, not a dramatic moment of temptation with voices and visions. Just a scholar in a ruin, touching stone, feeling the admiration that excellence demands, and not yet knowing how to separate that admiration from what the excellence was used for. This is where it begins. Now here is where it gets strange, because we need to think about what Saruman comes back with. He returns to the West eventually. The full timeline is not given, but by Third Age 2463, Tolkien notes the formation of the White Council, the Council of the Wise, which includes Saruman, Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan, and other great elves of the age. Saruman is named its head. We have, therefore, a rough upper bound. Saruman is back in the West, and established enough in reputation to be chosen as the council's leader by somewhere around the mid-second millennium of the Third Age, meaning his eastern journey spans somewhere between 300 and perhaps 800 years. 800 years of wandering, most of it in the east, most of it alone, with ruins and remnants, and the accumulated evidence of Sauron's methods. And then he sits down in a council with Galadriel and Gandalf and Elrond, and announces that he is the most qualified to lead. And they agree, and this is the part that should stop you cold. Galadriel agrees. The Lady of the Golden Wood, who bears Nenya, the Ring of Adamant, who has lived since the First Age, who has the sight and the will and the deep knowledge of the rings and their maker. Galadriel defers to Saruman. She wanted Gandalf as head of the council. Unfinished Tales tells us this directly. In the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, she preferred Gandalf. She was overruled by Saruman's credentials. Think about that. Galadriel, with all her perception, with her ring sense, with the ages of wisdom she carries, is looking at Saruman and either not seeing what he has brought back from the east, or not yet seeing it clearly enough to act on what she suspects. Or, and here the speculation becomes genuinely dark, she sees it. She sees the beginning of the problem, and she cannot prove it. And in the politics of the White Council, proof matters, because this is not a court of absolute monarchy, but a gathering of the powerful, and the powerful require evidence before they act. Galadriel has an intuition about Saruman. She does not yet have a case. This will be true for nearly 500 more years. The White Council convenes properly around Third Age 2463, and Saruman's tenure as its head stretched across nearly 5 centuries to the Council's last meeting in 2953, is a masterclass in the kind of corruption that looks indistinguishable from institutional conservatism. This is what makes the Council years so insidious and so fascinating. Saruman is not obviously wrong. He is cautious when caution seems wise. He is expert when expertise seems relevant. He quotes his Eastern credentials at every turn, and those credentials are real. He knows more about Sauron's methods than any being in the council chamber. But knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing, and this is the distinction that the council years demonstrate over and over, if you read them carefully. The first major crisis comes in Third Age 2851. Gandalf has gone to Dol Guldur, the fortress in the south of Mirkwood, and confirmed what has been suspected for decades. The necromancer dwelling there is not some lesser darkness. It is Sauron, returned, gathering power. Gandalf brings this intelligence to the White Council and urges immediate action. They need to move against Dol Guldur now, before Sauron fully re-establishes himself. Saruman says no. He overrides the motion. He argues that it is premature, that they do not have sufficient intelligence, that the risk outweighs the benefit. And the council defers to him, as it has deferred to him for 4 centuries, because he is the head and because his caution has always seemed wise before. But now here is what the text actually says. Tolkien, in Unfinished Tales, does not leave us guessing about Saruman's real reason. The real reason is that by 2851, Saruman has already begun searching the Gladden fields for the One Ring. He knows the ring went into the river Anduin when Isildur was killed in Third Age Year 2, and he knows Isildur died near the Gladden fields, and he has calculated that the ring may be recoverable. He wants to find it. If he is the one who brings the One Ring to the White Council, the leadership of the war against Sauron becomes his by right. The ring becomes his instrument for defeating Sauron on Sauron's own terms, and the new world that follows belongs to the architect of that victory. He is not opposing Gandalf's motion because he thinks Gandalf is wrong about Sauron. He is opposing it because flushing Sauron out of Dol Guldur might accelerate the ring's movements in ways that complicate his search. Let that sit for a moment. In the year 2851 of the Third Age, nearly 19 centuries into his presence in Middle-earth, Saruman is already running his own agenda inside the White Council. He is not yet Sauron's enemy. He is not yet Sauron's servant. He is his own third faction, and he is using the council as cover while he pursues a private power bid that has nothing to do with either defeating darkness or surrendering to it. This is not a man who has been seduced by Sauron. This is a man who has decided he can outmaneuver Sauron if he gets the right tool first. And it is a profoundly Ollian ambition. Think about the Silmarillion's account of Olli himself, who made the dwarves in secret because he could not wait for Ilúvatar to make speaking creatures of his own, not out of malice, out of the maker's impatience. The craftsman's certainty that if you understand the principles well enough, you can produce the desired outcome yourself without waiting for the proper authority. Aula was corrected, gently, by Ilúvatar himself, and he submitted. But the impulse, that particular craftsman's arrogance, remained in his lineage. And here it is in Saruman, 5,000 years later, expressing itself not in the creation of life, but in the hunger for the ring. Now here is where it gets genuinely devastating, because we need to talk about what Saruman does between 2851 and 2941. For 90 years he searches the Gladden fields. He sends agents. He devotes resources. He maintains the posture of a wise council head while spending decades in a parallel private operation directed entirely toward his own elevation. And he finds nothing. The ring has moved. As Tolkien tells us elsewhere, the ring has its own will, its own intention, its own gravitational pull toward the hand that can use it, and the situation that will allow it to return to its maker. The ring spent centuries drifting down the Anduin, eventually found by the creature Déagol, lost to his cousin Sméagol who became Gollum, and hidden in the roots of the misty mountains. It was never in the Gladden fields by the time Saruman looked. It had already moved on. Picture this, Saruman, somewhere along the banks of the Anduin, in perhaps the year 2880 or 2890. He has been searching for years. He has exhausted the most obvious sites. He has had his agents comb the riverbed, the shores, the marshes, nothing. And he is standing in a landscape that is returning to greenness after the long absence of Sauron's direct influence. And he is contemplating the possibility that he has wasted decades. That the ring has outmaneuvered him, that an object of Sauron's making, an object of will and malice that Tolkien's cosmology defines as genuinely volitional, has effectively anticipated his search and made itself unavailable. A craftsman, outwitted by the craft. This is the humiliation that precedes the next escalation. This is the wound to his competence that does not heal properly, that instead scabs over into resentment, and then into something more focused and more dangerous. He will not be outwitted again. He will go back to studying. He will go back to the methods he knows best. And so by 2941, when the White Council meets again, and Gandalf again urges action against Dol Guldur, Saruman's calculation has changed. He consents this time, but not because Gandalf has finally persuaded him of the urgency. Tolkien's text in Unfinished Tales is explicit about this as well. Saruman consents because his search for the ring has been unsuccessful, because he now fears that Sauron will find it first, and because flushing Sauron out of Mirkwood serves his purpose now. If Sauron is driven from his fortress and forced to retreat eastward, his attention is away from the Gladden fields and toward his own survival, which gives Saruman more time. Two different decisions, both in the White Council, both driven by Saruman's private agenda, both conducted behind a mask of institutional authority and collected wisdom. And notice what he is doing that nobody in the council room can quite prove. He is using the White Council as a resource, while treating it as a subordinate instrument of his own design. He leads the council the way a general leads a scout company, as a tool that serves the real war being conducted at a level the scouts cannot see. This is not the behavior of a man who is corrupted. This is the behavior of a man who has decided he knows better, who has spent so many centuries accumulating expertise that he has arrived at the conclusion that expertise licenses him to make decisions on behalf of everyone else without consulting them. Who has studied the methods of a tyrant so long and so carefully that he has absorbed the tyrant's epistemology without noticing? The certainty that the one who understands the situation most deeply has the right, even the obligation, to act on that understanding without the inconvenience of consensus. This is when Saruman settles in Orthanc. Third Age 2759, Tolkien records in Appendix B of The Return of the King. The King of Rohan grants Saruman the use of the fortress of Orthanc, the tower built by the Númenóreans in the Second Age, one of the 4 towers of the Palantiri. Saruman accepts. And here is something the casual reader skips past. Orthanc is not just a tower. It is, as Unfinished Tales tells us in the Palantiri, one of the 7 seeing stones brought from Númenor and distributed across the Western kingdoms. The Palantiri are communication devices, built by the Númenóreans using knowledge derived ultimately from the craft of the elves, capable of seeing across great distances and, crucially, capable of establishing contact between stones. The Master Stone, the Palantir of the Elendilmir in Minas Tirith, could in principle reach all others, but the stone in Orthanc could reach, in particular, the stone at Minas Tirith and the stone at Barad-dûr. The stone at Barad-dûr, Sauron's stone. Saruman knows this. Of course he knows this. He has spent centuries accumulating lore of the enemy's methods, and the Palantiri, having been corrupted and captured by Sauron, are part of that archive. When he accepts Orthanc, he is accepting a fortress that contains a direct line to the Dark Lord. And he keeps the stone. He does not destroy it. He does not surrender it to Minas Tirith for safekeeping. He sits in Orthanc with it, and he uses it, first to gather intelligence, which is the reasonable justification, and then to gather more intelligence, and then to gather more, and then perhaps to look at Barad-dûr and see what is there, to measure what is there, to understand what is there, all of it framed in his own mind as the necessary work of a strategist who must understand his enemy. Unfinished Tales tells us that Saruman used his stone extensively, far more than was known. It tells us that he used it for information gathering across the Western world, keeping tabs on the movements of peoples and powers that the White Council knew nothing about because Saruman was not sharing what he learned. He had turned the Palantir from a council resource into a private intelligence apparatus, and at some point, Sauron looked back. This is the moment that the Tolkien mythos circles around with a particular dread, and the text is careful not to give us a precise date, which is itself a clue about how gradual it was. There was not a single catastrophic session where Sauron seized control of Saruman's mind through the stone. It was slower, more like weather than an assault. Sauron was in Barad-dûr, growing, rebuilding, and the stone at Barad-dûr was one of his instruments of perception. When Saruman looked east through Orthanc's stone, Sauron eventually noticed the looking, turned to face it, began, in the most patient and methodical way imaginable, to show Saruman things that were designed to be shown. This is the cosmological architecture of Tolkien's evil. It never creates, it only perverts. It works with what is there. And what is there in Saruman's mind when Sauron turns to face him through the stone is a man who has already decided that he knows better, already decided that the ring should be in better hands than Sauron's, already decided that industrial power is a legitimate tool if wielded for the right purpose, already decided that Gandalf is a rival rather than a colleague. Sauron does not need to install new beliefs in Saruman. He just needs to find the ones that are already there and water them. Pay attention to this next part, because this is where the Eastern journeys loop back and become something different in retrospect. Everything Saruman learned in Rhûn, all those centuries of studying Sauron's methods and Sauron's craft, prepared him to become a different kind of villain than most of the ones in Tolkien's legendarium. He is not a servant like the Nazgûl, enslaved by rings that have consumed their original wearer's wills. He is not a lieutenant like Gothmog or Draugluin, created for service. He is not Sauron himself, a primordial intelligence of terrifying scope. He is something new in the mythology, a being of the West who has voluntarily absorbed enough of the East's logic to begin operating by its rules. The industrialization of Isengard is the most visible symptom of this. The felling of the forests around Orthanc, the mining operations, the breeding of Uruk-hai, the development of an army capable of fighting in daylight, which the older generations of orcs could not do. All of this reflects a productivity-first, purpose-before-beauty logic that is fundamentally Sauron's approach to the world, dressed in Saruman's colors. Tolkien describes it in The Two Towers, when Gandalf brings Theoden to the ruins of Orthanc's surroundings after the Ents assault. The machines, the pits, the stumps, the reduction of a living landscape to a factory. This is the East, translated West. This is what Saruman brought back in his mind from those centuries of Eastern study and eventually, after decades more of Palantir corruption, put into practice. And here is the lore connection that almost nobody makes explicit. The Blue Wizards, LOTR and Palando, also went east, also went into Rhûn and the further lands. And Tolkien's notes on their fate, which are frustratingly fragmentary and appear in both unfinished tales and the later notes published in The Peoples of Middle-earth, suggest that they too fell, that they too became distorted by what they encountered, that they established cults of magic in the East that persisted into the Fourth Age. The East, in Tolkien's Legendarium, is not simply a different geography, it is a different moral climate, heavy with the residue of Sauron's long dominion, and extended immersion in it without the balancing connection to the free peoples of the West seems to corrode the Astari's mission purpose, to replace the reason they came with something else. Gandalf went nowhere near the East, not in any documented journey. Gandalf's travels in the Third Age take him through the Shire, through Eriador, through Rohan and Gondor, north to Mirkwood, up to the Blue Mountains, through Bree and Hobbiton, and the Inns of Men. His geography is relentlessly human, and Hobbit and Elvish, relentlessly anchored in the communities of the free peoples whose survival was his actual brief. He never stopped learning, but he learned from people rather than from ruins, from living resistance rather than from the archaeology of domination. The contrast is not accidental. Tolkien did not design the Astari randomly. The distribution of their geographies and their fates is a pattern. Gandalf, anchored west, anchored in relationship, succeeds. The Blue Wizards, anchored east, go native in the worst possible sense. Saruman, who split the difference, who spent centuries east and then returned west but carried the east inside him, becomes the most complex of the failures because he is the most recognizably human in his trajectory. He is a scholar who went too deep into the archive. Picture this: the White Council meeting of Third Age, 2851. The chamber is not described in the text, but imagine it as something elvish in design, in Rivendell perhaps, or one of the remaining houses of lore in the West, with light coming from directions that shouldn't quite work, with the age of the beings in the room, creating a kind of gravity that younger presences would feel in their bones. Galadriel is there. Elrond is there. Gandalf is there, weathered and restless, smelling faintly of pipe smoke. And Saruman is at the head of the table, and he is the most impressive person in the room by almost any conventional measure, the most documented expertise, the most assembled lore, the most obviously intelligent voice. And Gandalf is urging action. Gandalf is saying, "The necromancer is Sauron. I have confirmed it. We must move now. We must drive him from Dol Guldur before he grows stronger." And Saruman says no. And you can hear, if you listen for it, the shape of what Saruman is actually thinking underneath the arguments he presents. He is thinking, "You do not understand the scope of this. You are a wanderer who talks to hobbits and lights fireworks and collects gossip along the road. I have walked through Sauron's Eastern Empire for centuries. I have studied his methods at a depth that makes your intelligence gathering look like children's guesses. I know what Sauron is, what he is capable of, and what we would need to defeat him. And the answer is not your plan. He is not wrong about knowing more. He is catastrophically wrong about what that knowledge means. Because the thing that Gandalf has, and Saruman lacks, the thing that Círdan perceived at the Grey Havens in the year 1000, is not knowledge. It is something older than knowledge, something the Ainulindal at the very beginning of the Silmarillion tries to articulate when it describes the music of the Ainur and the theme of Ilúvatar. It is alignment. It is the condition of a will that has not bent toward itself, that is still pointing at the thing it was originally pointed at. Gandalf wanders because wandering keeps him in contact. It keeps him corrected, calibrated, reoriented by the actual texture of the world he is supposed to be serving. He cannot drift too far into abstraction because the road keeps bringing him back to a hobbit who needs encouragement, to a dwarf company that needs guidance, to a child playing in a meadow who needs to know that the person who knows fireworks also knows kindness. The small things correct the large ones. The particular prevents the general from becoming imperial. Saruman, who moved through ruins rather than through communities, who gathered lore rather than relationships, who studied effects rather than experiencing causes, had nothing to correct him. No one who knew him well enough to say, Curunir, you are starting to think like the thing you are studying. No one whose trust he valued enough to let those words land. And so he drifted. Let us be precise about the timeline of Orthanc and the Palantir, because the precision matters. Saruman takes Orthanc in 2759. The White Council holds its meeting about Dol Guldur in 2851, and Saruman vetoes action. In 2941, he consents to the assault, but only because his private agenda has shifted. Tolkien notes in Appendix B that around this period, Saruman begins to search near the Gladden Fields. The appendices also note that around 2953, the last meeting of the White Council is held, and that afterwards Saruman fortifies Isengard. And they note that from this period forward, Saruman begins drawing his own network of informants and spies, independent of the council, watching the Shire in particular, watching for any sign of the ring. So we have a timeline that runs from approximately 2851 to 2953, a century of increasing privatization, increasing fortification, increasing separation from the council's nominal purpose. 100 years of turning the apparatus of resistance into the apparatus of personal ambition. And across all of this, the Palantir is running. Not as a weapon yet. Not as the thing that Sauron uses to break Denethor's mind and shatter Pippin's stability. Just as a tool. Just as a window that Saruman keeps looking through, telling himself he is gathering intelligence, telling himself he is knowing his enemy, telling himself that looking is not the same as being seen. But Sauron sees everyone who looks. That is the nature of the Master Stone. That is the cosmological reality that Tolkien builds into the Palantir lore. And by 2953, by the time Saruman shuts the council down and turns to fortifying Isengard in earnest, the looking has become something else. Not communication, not yet, but familiarity, recognition. The beginning of the terrible feeling that the person on the other end of the window, the being of vast, dark intelligence, whose methods you spent centuries studying in ruins, knows you, really knows you, sees you more clearly than the colleagues in your council who only ever saw the performance. There is something seductive about being truly known, even by a monster. Now think about where we are in the chronology. Third Age 2759 to 2953. Nearly 200 years of Saruman in Orthanc with the stone. Nearly 200 years of the council meeting under his leadership, while he runs a parallel operation, and during this time, what is actually happening in the world around him. The watchful peace has ended. Sauron has returned to Dol Guldur. The shadow in Mirkwood has been growing darker for decades. The Nazgul, Sauron's 9 enslaved ringwraiths, have retaken Minas Morgul in 2002. The dwarves of Erebor have been driven from their home by the dragon Smaug. The line of the kings of Gondor has failed. The realm of Arnor has been long destroyed. and Saruman is in Orthanc, studying. The world is losing ground. The free peoples are under constant pressure, and the person the Valar designated as the chief instrument of resistance is sitting in a tower, doing scholarship and running his own political operation. This is not laziness. This is not indifference. This is the logical endpoint of a particular kind of ambition. The belief that preparation matters more than action. That you cannot move until you understand everything. That the person who knows most should act last because they are too valuable to risk. It is the scholar's version of cowardice, dressed in the language of strategy. And Saruman wears it so naturally that even Galadriel, who has been suspicious for decades, cannot quite bring herself to break openly with him because his argument is not wrong. He does know more. He is more prepared, in the abstract sense, than anyone else in the council. What he is not is willing. And willingness, in Tolkien's world, is not just a psychological quality. It is a cosmological one. Because here is what the Ainulindala tells us, in the very opening of the Silmarillion, about how Ilúvatar's creation works. The music is the design. The world that emerges from the music is what that design becomes in matter and time. And the dissonance that Melkor introduced into the music, the self-serving theme that made the music about the singer rather than the song, is the original template of all evil in Tolkien's legendarium. Sauron is the most powerful inheritor of that dissonance, and the question of whether Saruman falls is ultimately the question of whether his will, his own internal music, stays aligned with the theme he was sent to sing, or gradually shifts toward a theme that is about himself. By 2953, the theme has already shifted. The fortification of Isengard is not a defensive measure taken on behalf of the free peoples. It is a power base. It is the material expression of a man who has decided that the only version of safety he trusts is the one he controls. And Sauron, in Barad-dûr, is watching through the stone and thinking, excellent. The year 3001. The One Ring is still missing. Bilbo Baggins has returned from his adventure in the east with a golden ring he found in the roots of the Misty Mountains. And Gandalf is beginning to have suspicions about it, that he will spend the next 17 years investigating. Saruman, if he is receiving intelligence from his network of informants, is likely aware of this. He is certainly aware that something came out of the Misty Mountains with Bilbo, because Gandalf is asking questions that suggest a significant discovery. But the Gladden Fields search has been abandoned. The ring that Gollum had is not the ring Saruman was searching for, at least not definitively. And then, slowly, in the years between 3001 and 3018, the evidence accumulates. The ring has been in the Shire, in Bag End, with a hobbit named Frodo Baggins, who has inherited it from his uncle. Saruman knows this. His agents in the Shire have been watching. He knows before Gandalf does, in all likelihood, that the ring is in Hobbiton, and he does not tell the council, because by this point, the council has effectively dissolved. He does not tell Gandalf, because Gandalf is a rival. He calculates, and calculates, and waits, and by the time Gandalf figures it out and begins moving the hobbit toward safety, Saruman's window of opportunity has closed. And that is when he makes the final decision, the decision that turns the shadow on his heart into active treason. Picture this. The Tower of Orthanc, Third Age 3018, before the Fellowship sets out from Rivendell. Gandalf has come to Saruman for help, arriving at Isengard and climbing the tower. And everything Saruman has become for the last 500 years is now visible in a single conversation. Tolkien gives us this scene in the chapter The Council of Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring, where Gandalf recounts it for the assembled council. Saruman's voice is described as beautiful and persuasive, capable of making wrong things seem right. He lays out his vision. He says that the time for subtlety is over, that Sauron will prevail unless matched with matching power, that the wise must take the ring themselves and use it, and that Gandalf should join him in this new order. And Gandalf refuses. and Saruman imprisons him on the top of Orthanc. This is the moment where everything prior becomes visible at once. Every Eastern journey, every manipulated council vote, every decade of private searching in the Gladden fields, every year of Palantir gazing, all of it has been a preparation for this argument, this offer, this vision of a world remade by someone who believes his expertise licenses him to make that decision alone. Saruman has not become Sauron. He has become something in some ways more tragic, a being who has studied evil so thoroughly that he has learned to execute its logic while believing himself to be opposing it. He does not think he is serving Sauron. He genuinely thinks he is offering a superior alternative, the ring in his hands instead of Sauron's hands. The Dark Lord's methods deployed for a better purpose. He is absolutely sincere. And this is the place where the Eastern journeys reveal their final meaning. Sauron's greatest achievement, in the corrupting of Saruman, was not the Palantir, it was the education. The decades and centuries of immersive study in rune, where a scholar learned to see through the enemy's eyes, trained Saruman in something more dangerous than Sauron's techniques. It trained him in Sauron's self-justification, the internal narrative that says, "I have no choice but to do this, because the alternative is worse." The logic that says, "Power in wrong hands is the problem, therefore I must get power first." The conviction that, "I understand this situation better than anyone else, and therefore my unilateral action is not tyranny, it is responsibility." This is the argument Sauron made to the elves of Eregion in the Second Age, when he came to them as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He said, "Let me help you make rings of power. Let me share my craft. Let me give you the tools to preserve your world from the ravages of time. Because preservation is good, and craft is good, and surely the intention behind the power is what matters." And Celebrimbor and the elvish craftsmen of Eregion believed him, partly because they wanted to believe him, partly because the argument was not without internal logic, and partly because Sauron's craftsman's eloquence was genuinely beautiful and genuinely persuasive. Saruman, 5,000 years later, is making the same argument, not to the elves, to Gandalf. And he has come to make it not because Sauron told him to, but because he reasoned his way there himself, using principles he absorbed over centuries of study. The corruption was pedagogical. Sauron educated Saruman into Sauron's own logic through the sheer accumulated weight of evidence in ruins and remnants, and Palantir glimpses, until Saruman arrived, by his own independent reasoning, at the conclusion Sauron needed him to reach. This is the thing that should stop you cold. Sauron did not need to command Saruman, he just needed to teach him. And the Valar, by sending a craftsman scholar to study the enemy's methods, had inadvertently enrolled Saruman in Sauron's curriculum centuries before the Palantir ever came into play. Now we reach the deepest wound in the Legendarium, and it is not about Saruman. It is about the decision that was made before he ever set foot on a ship. Manwë designed the mission of the Astari. Tolkien says so in Unfinished Tales, in the Astari. The design was deliberate. Send Maiar in embodied form, limited in power, unable to match Sauron on his own terms, required to work through the free peoples rather than over them. The intention was to avoid the situation of the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, when Valinor's armies came to Middle-earth and, in defeating Morgoth, destroyed much of the world. The Astari mission was the gentle approach, the human-scale approach, the approach that respects the agency of the peoples of Middle-earth to choose their own futures. And the one they chose to lead this mission, the one they designated as chief among the five, was the craftsman who knew the most about Sauron's methods. Here is the question that the lore has been building toward, underneath every other question this video has asked, and I want to say it plainly, without hedging it into nothing, because the lore earns the directness. Did Manwë know? Not know about the specific trajectory of Saruman's corruption, not know the exact sequence of Eastern wandering and council manipulation and Palantir gazing and final treason, but know, in the way that a being of Manwë's perspective and depth knows things, that sending the craftsman scholar to study the craftsman tyrant contained a structural risk. That the being whose greatest strength was the depth of his understanding of Sauron's methods was precisely the being whose greatest vulnerability would be the gradual osmosis of those methods into his own operating assumptions. The Valaquenta, in the Silmarillion, tells us that Manwë is the one who best understands the purpose of Ilúvatar. He sees the music in its totality. He is not blind to consequence, and yet he chooses Saruman, or he chooses the one who will become Saruman. He sends to Middle-earth the being whose greatest credential is the length and depth of his immersion in the enemy's world. Perhaps, because the logic is not unreasonable, perhaps the craftsman scholar is genuinely the best instrument for this particular war. Perhaps no being who had not studied Sauron's methods could hope to advise effectively against them. Perhaps the risk of sending Saruman was calculated and accepted as the price of the mission's potential effectiveness. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that the legendarium does not resolve, that Tolkien left deliberately unresolved, that sits in the silence between the grand design and its catastrophic execution. Perhaps Manwë, for all his perception of Ilúvatar's purpose, did not fully model what a craftsman's soul does when it is steeped too long in the methods of a craftsman tyrant without correction or community. Perhaps the Ainur, who were formed before the creation of the world, who made their choices and their natures in the pure light before embodied experience, do not quite understand how much the embodied experience changes what a person becomes, how the world you walk through leaves its mark on the walker, how a scholar who spends centuries alone in ruins becomes, in some cellular way, part of those ruins. Tolkien's Letter 144 is careful to say that the Istari were genuinely at risk, genuinely subject to temptation, genuinely capable of failure. This was not a design flaw that surprised the Valar. It was a designed-in vulnerability, accepted as the cost of sending beings with real agency rather than puppets with predetermined outcomes. The Valar wanted free beings, serving freely, not compelled instruments of the divine will. And free beings can choose wrongly. Saruman was meant to be free. But there is a difference between free beings can fail, as an accepted risk, and we sent the being whose specific nature made this specific failure almost inevitable, as a design decision. And the question of which of those statements describes the Valar's choice of Saruman is not clearly answered anywhere in Tolkien's work. Picture this. Manwë, in Valinor, in some unspecified year before Third Age 1000, before the Istari are sent. He is deliberating over which Maiar to choose. The world below is in danger. Sauron is rebuilding. The free peoples are scattered and reduced, unable to resist a direct assault from the full weight of Barad-dûr's power. Something must be done that is not another Valinorian military invasion. The free peoples must be guided, inspired, helped to find their own courage and coordination. Who do you send? You send the one who knows the enemy best. Of course you do. That is the logic of the strategic mind. You send the being with the greatest relevant expertise. And Curanir, among all the Maiar of Aule's household, has the deepest scholarship of Sauron's methods, the clearest understanding of how the enemy works, the most extensive archive of relevant knowledge. He is the obvious choice, the logical choice. And Manwë knows, in the deep way Manwë knows things, that this particular Maiar's greatest strength and his deepest vulnerability are the same thing, the craftsman's love of understanding, the scholar's need to know, the expert's certainty that the one who knows most is best positioned to act. Does Manwë hesitate? Does he hold Curanir's commission and feel, in that vast and ancient mind, the shape of what is being risked? Does he weigh Gandalf, the one Círdan will one day say has the greatest spirit, and wonder whether to make him the leader instead? Does he choose Curanir as head of the Order, knowing, on some level, that Círdan's perception will eventually make the choice academic, that the real leader will be the Grey Wanderer, even if the institutional title belongs to the White One? The text does not tell us, and the silence of the text is the point. Because Tolkien understood that the deepest questions about the design of the world, about the gap between divine intention and embodied outcome, about whether the author of the music knew what the music would become, are questions that do not resolve. They persist. They are the wound that never quite closes. Let me pull back now. Let me say what all of this means. Saruman traveled for 17 centuries before he sat in a tower. He walked through the ruins of Sauron's Eastern Empire, and he catalogued them with the precision of a master craftsman's apprentice, learning his trade by dissection. He returned west, carrying the most comprehensive archive of the enemy's methods that any being in the Third Age possessed. He led a council of the wise for 500 years, and in those 500 years he used the council's legitimacy to pursue his own agenda, while presenting the mask of institutional wisdom to everyone in the room. He sat in Orthanc with a palantir, and he looked east, and then he looked east again, and then he looked east again, until the distinction between looking at Sauron and being seen by Sauron became academic. And then, at the end of all that looking, he invited Gandalf to join him in a project that was Sauron's project, with a different name on the door. He was never mindless. He was never simple. He was, until the very end, the most intelligent voice in the room. And this is precisely what made him more dangerous than almost any other villain in the Legendarium, because evil that can justify itself intellectually, evil that arrives wearing the robes of expertise and strategic necessity and informed consent, evil that speaks beautifully about difficult choices and the necessity of matching force with force, is so much harder to refuse than evil that simply announces itself. Tolkien knew this, and this is why the Saruman story is not just a wizard goes bad story. It is a story about what happens to understanding when it is not anchored by love, about what knowledge becomes when it is accumulated without the corrective weight of ongoing human, or hobbit, or elvish relationship, about how the craftsman's most valuable gift, the ability to see how things work, the ability to get inside the logic of a system and understand it from within, can become the craftsman's most catastrophic liability when the system being studied is designed to absorb the student. Sauron's power, the Silmarillion establishes, always works by perversion. It takes what is there and bends it. Saruman's love of craft, Saruman's love of knowledge, Saruman's very genuine and very admirable commitment to understanding the enemy. These were real virtues. The corruption did not replace them with vices. It bent them, slowly, over centuries, into shapes that were functionally indistinguishable from what they opposed. A love of craft bent into a hunger for the ring, a commitment to understanding bent into the logic of domination, a scholar's independence bent into a tyrant's solipsism. The shape is the same, only the orientation has shifted, and the shift was so gradual, so accumulated across so many years of justified decisions, that by the time it was complete, there was no single moment Saruman could point to and say, "That is when I chose this." He chose it over and over, in small increments, across 17 centuries of travel and study, and institutional maneuvering and palantir gazing. He chose it every time he decided that knowing more mattered more than staying connected. He chose it every time he used his expertise as a reason to override consensus rather than a reason to inform it. He chose it every time he looked east through the stone and told himself that looking was not the same as being claimed. It was. It always was. And now, here, at the end of everything this video has built, the question that opened this script. Not, did Saruman choose to fall? Because clearly, in some accumulated sense, he did. Every micro-decision was his own. No one forced him into the eastern ruins. No one forced him to keep the stone. No one forced him to search the Gladden fields in secret while the council deliberated above his private agenda. He had the freedom to be otherwise. And that freedom is what makes his failure a genuine tragedy, rather than a mechanism. The real question, the one that gets heavier the more lore you carry. Was the architecture of Saruman's fall built into the architecture of his appointment? Did Manwë send to Middle-earth a being whose deepest nature contained the specific vulnerability that Sauron's specific power would inevitably find and press? And did he do this knowing, on some level, that the vast and ancient mind of Manwë operates on, that the craftsman scholar was the most knowledgeable instrument and also the least survivable one? Was there a version of this mission in which Saruman succeeded? Or was the Valar's greatest strategic asset, the being they chose for his incomparable knowledge of the enemy, always also their most catastrophically exploitable point of failure? Tolkien does not answer this. He leaves the question in the architecture of the world, hidden in the gap between Manwë's designation of Saruman as leader and Círdan's gift of the ring to Gandalf, as though even the shipwright at the shore could feel what the Valar's logic had missed. As though the sea wisdom that saw most truly in that first grey morning on the Mithlond shore had perceived the structural fault before a single step had been taken into the east. Maybe that is the most devastating thing in the entire Saruman story, not the fall itself, but the possibility that something new from the very beginning, that the fall was already latent in the design, that the most qualified being in Middle-earth to resist the Ringmaker was also, by virtue of that qualification, the most vulnerable to being slowly claimed by everything the Ringmaker had built. Not a traitor who chose evil, a scholar who studied darkness so long and so carefully and so alone that he forgot there was a difference between understanding it and becoming it. And by the time he sat in Orthanc, with a Palantir in his hands and 17 centuries of Eastern knowledge in his mind, the corruption was not arriving. It was merely being acknowledged. If this question sits with you the way it sits with me, I would genuinely like to know what you think. Not about whether Saruman is sympathetic or whether the movies did him justice, though those are interesting conversations, but about the deeper thing, about whether there is a version of a mission that sends its most qualified scholar into the deepest study of its most dangerous enemy and does not eventually produce something like this. Whether the Valar could have designed the Astari differently and produced better outcomes. Whether Gandalf's success and Saruman's failure were always going to be the two sides of the same coin. One who stayed close to the world he was sent to serve, and one who spent 17 centuries learning to see through the eyes of the thing he was sent to resist. That conversation should be in the comments. And if this kind of reading, this following of the lore all the way down to the places the main text doesn't quite reach, is what you came here for, then stay close. There are more doors to open, and none of them open from the outside.